Welcome back. I'm Terry Burns, and this is a continuation of my class on the Monas Hieroglyphica or Hieroglyphic Monad of Dr. John Dee. We're up to Theorem 13 now, and in fact, this is a redo. A big thanks to one of the students in this class, Howling Yord, for pointing out an error on one of my graphics. So since I gave you some homework on this, and since I want you to figure out some of these things on your own, I thought I would just redo the whole thing. You know, if you have been in this class, the drill by now. I'm assuming you know who John Dee is. I'm assuming you know what the hieroglyphic monad is. I'm assuming you've watched the earlier videos. This isn't the best place to jump in, although I'd love to have you in the class, and there's a playlist below of the whole series. But Dee has, in the first 10 theorems, symbolically created the universe with references to a variety of cosmogenic texts, the Sefer Yetzirah, biblical Genesis, Plato's Timaeus, which is a Pythagorean creation story in ways. And then after the universe is created, everything gets formed. That's Theorem 11. Then in Theorem 12, he talks about great world ages. And it seems like he's waiting for the world to end. But in fact, what you see is that he's looking for how we bring back the golden age. Now, eventually that's going to be biblical revelation seen through a geometric lens, but we've got a long way to go until we get to that. What I want to do here is have you look at this Kabbalistically. So we also have previous videos below in how we know that the tree of life Dee is using is the so-called Kircher tree. The one you see on your screen now that is, it's still the main structure of the tree of life used by Hermetic and Christian Kabbalists. Not Rabbinic Kabbalists have many, many different structures of the tree of life, but you get this form sort of solidified by the late Renaissance and the Rosicrucian era. It's sometimes called the Kircher tree because Kircher is the first to overtly picture it out, but Dee is using it, and Dee is not the first to use this structure of the tree either. As I've talked about in another video on John Dee sources of Kabbalah, his source is probably Reuchlin's Art of Kabbalah, which is more than 50 years before Dee writes the Monad. And Reuchlin's source is probably Paolo Rizio or Paulus Ricius, if you prefer to Latinize it, who is a converso Jew in a time where it's very dangerous to be Jewish. So he becomes Christian, but then he translates into Latin Kabbalistic texts, most famously the Port of Light of Gikatia, who was a student of the great Spanish Kabbalist of the 12th century, Abraham Abulafia. And since Gikatia's 12th century works in Hebrew are now translated into English also, we can see very clearly how that, for example, these cross paths, if you follow my cursor there, these cross paths between Sephiroth on the left and right pillars have cross paths, and that doesn't show up down here. Well, actually in Gikatia's work, it does show up. Riccio just isn't picturing them here. And also, you see this place where my cursor is going, which would be much more appropriately actually than pictured in the Kircher tree. That's explicitly referred to in Gikatia's text. So that's the tree you're going to use. And what I wanted you to do with this theorem was see if you could understand on your own the graphics relationship to Kabbalah. This glyph of the monad and all the other glyphs in there work as mnemonic devices, and things stick in memory a lot better if you're trying to do the permutations on your own without me just telling you what they are. So I'm going to walk you through this, but then give you that short assignment again at the end, though I'll tell it to you now. You want to refer each one of these symbols that you're seeing, and this symbol is the graphic in Theorem 13, which we're discussing. I'll give you the text in a moment. But all these symbols in Theorem 13, you want to refer them to the tree of life, that so-called Kircher tree of life I just showed you. You can have it be either the manifest tree, that is the one after creation, or it can be the one as creation is forming that you get Dee talking about in the first theorems, although it's not totally clear that's what he's doing until theorems 9 and 10. All right. You can do the same thing with physical alchemy, but we're not going to do that until after Theorem 14. It would be easier to do that all at once than at the same time. I've also pointed out in earlier theorems places where the second edition, the Frankfurt edition, which was also in Latin and also came out while Dee was still alive, there are just a few places where it's slightly different, and one of them is in this graphic, where you see how the 2 there, where my cursor is pointing, is tilted on the side. That's different from the original. I take it as just a kind of nudge to realize some things, the same way that it was so helpful to have the monad flipped on the final page of that Frankfurt edition. But in our 2021 translation, Dr. Turner and I use this graphic because I think I'm giving you enough of a nudge with these videos that you probably don't need the 2 tipped on its side. Okay, so remember in Theorem 12, quick review, Dee says that the ancient wise ones have passed down hieroglyphic signs of the planets. And we know that by hieroglyphic signs, Dee doesn't mean Egyptian hieroglyphics, he means a condensed sacred symbol. Have a whole wordplay video on that also below. He says hieroglyphic symbols of the 5 planets, and there's 7 classical planets, but he's taking the moon and sun, the 2 luminaries, out of there, 5 and 2 is 7, and saying that the others are made out of either parts, the characteristics of the sun and the moon, along with the elements. That's the cross of the elephant, elements, not elephant, in his monad symbol, and this sign for Aries, the fire sign down there at the bottom, that is going to be rekindling the whole thing here in Theorem 13. I also talked about how that while Dee says the ancient wise ones have passed these down, we can't really find any evidence of that. Maybe they did, but it's probably more likely that he intuited them, and in intuiting these symbols and kind of perfecting the symbols of the planets, can we say, he's doing a parallel action to what Kabbalists do with Hebrew. That is, the sacred language of creation and the language of Mosaic law, they seem to be improving upon. Well, why would you do that? Well, because the idea is that it's deteriorated over time. So by contemplating it, meditating over it, thinking about it very deeply, they are correcting imperfections that have crept in. A third parallel motion here is that of magicians in the Renaissance, who are trying to, through angel magic, perfect these kind of sigils that you get in medieval magic that no one's really sure what shape they relate to, or there are different versions of it and so on. So angel magic becomes revelatory. You try for a revelation from the angels. The obvious example of this later in Dee's life is his angelic conversations with Edward Kelly. Anyway, Christian Kabbalists go in and literally appropriate rabbinic Kabbalah and match it to their belief system as an act of revelation. So they already have the notion that the Old Testament prefigures the New Testament. So Adam then is seen as prefiguring Jesus. So then as you get many Kabbalistic meanings of Adam, not just the guy in the first book of Genesis, but also red earth, many other things when we talk about projections onto the tree of life, which we will do in this video, then that prefigures Jesus. In Hermetic Kabbalah, since there are many non-Christians, myself among them, who practice Hermetic Kabbalah or study it, that becomes just the sacrifice God. But in the Christian Kabbalah of Dee's era, it's Jesus. It's Tetragrammaton, Yod-He Vav-He, or Yahweh, becoming Yod-He Shin Vav-He, or Yeshua, which is talked about in another work of Reuchlin, which I talked about in those earlier videos. So we also looked at with Theorem 12 how the 4 elements can be correlated to some of these planets. Earth, fire, air, and water correlate to 4 planets. What we don't have is the 5th element, ether, correlating to the dodecahedron. But we do implicitly, because here is, these are graphics from Theorem 12, remember. One thing I did not tell you was that this 5th element here seems to, logically, that it would correlate to the dodecahedron. Now, there's a little problem with that I'll discuss with physical alchemy. But first, let's just do a numeric rundown here. All right, in Theorem 12, we had 4 figures that are made out of the moon. There they are, first 2 columns. Yesod is referred to the moon. We have 4 made of the sun. That's these 2 columns. The sun is referred to Tifereth. Then we have 4 different iterations of Mercury. There's the one in the first column, the one in the 4th column, the seeming 5th element down here, and then the whole monad symbol is going to be another Mercury. So you can total that up to 12 if you want. You also know there's 10 Sephiroth, there's 7 classical planets. The motion that we've gone through is that the golden age is when the world is created, the 7 days of Genesis, and also those correlations to the golden age in both Hesiod and in Ovid. At creation, the monad is punctured. That's a stillbone or the pointy Aries symbol. The Pythagorean monad is a circle with a dot in the middle. And so that dot is representing the eternal, unchanging world of forms, puncturing and creating this world of becoming, if you're using the Timaeus as your referent. And if you are working using the tree of life, Bina becomes an exact corollary to the receptacle in Plato's Timaeus. As Bina receives all the energy that has come through Kether, then the Hokmah shot over to Bina, it condenses and it takes the light of Hokmah and it forms it into the images of creation. It does that through dot, D-A''A''T. And it creates the middle pillar while simultaneously the middle pillar is polarizing out to make the right and left sides. And that's also pictured as a lightning flash or a flaming sword. And you can use any of those conceptions you would like in your homework. So the next stage is associated then with Jupiter and Kesed. It begins when time begins. That's Aries of Aries. And the great tree forms. Aries of Aries, as we've talked about, is a 12th of 12 signs. And you might sense in the Timaeus, the perfect form is a sphere, and a dodecahedron is the 5th element because it most closely looks like a sphere. You might associate the cosmos with a dodecahedron. Certainly Timaeus does. In the fallen age, then you start a return to the golden age by working back up the tree of life. I am sure there are a multiplicity of other things that you could do, but this is what you're going to do to understand this theorem. You work back up the tree of life either individually or as a group, and it is the healing. It's what becomes in the work of Rabbi Luria, the healing of the shattered vessels, Tikkun Olam. But as I've talked about, there are similar ideas before Rabbi Luria. And in fact, one of them even gets Christianized and appears in Reuchlin's Art of Kabbalah. You can posit that as a 4th age, or you can be guided by spirit to do it now and create the great work. Now, why does D fudge a little bit between 3rd and 4th age? I would guess, although I can't prove this, that he's doing that so that he can have the 3 ages of Joachim of Fiore, but not tie it to a particular date and be wrong. And he can have the 4 turns that you need in physical alchemy, because it's a common but rather opaque until you understand it motion that you see in the writing of physical alchemists to have 4 turns and then you get the great work. So, and it's making the circle round. In the first English translation of Ripley's Compound of Alchemy, for example, there's even a poem to Dee about making the circle round. Well, this is what it's talking about. You go Saturn 90-degree turn, Jupiter 90-degree turn, Moon 90-degree turn, then another 90 degrees, you have a circle. You've made the circle round, and you have the Philosopher's Stone, the quintessence, the summum bonum, however you'd like to call it. So, but more on all of that after Theorem 14. So, we are looking at these symbols as they relate to both what is said in Theorem 12 and 13. Theorem 12 looked at how these first 2 columns are made out of symbols for the moon and the elements, and now we are going to do in 13 look at how these are made out of the sun, but we're going to look at much more than that as well. So let's read through Theorem 13 together, and then I'm going to break it into parts, and then I think you will find the the homework that I give you easier than you might expect it to be, because what you're going to be looking at in part are correspondences you probably already know with particular Sephiroth if you have studied Hermetic Kabbalah. So D says, is not the mystical character of Mars forged from the hieroglyphs of the Sun and Aries with the magisterium of some of the elements between them? And Venus, I entreat you, isn't it formed from the sun and a full unfolding of the elements? Thus these planets gaze upon the circumvolutions of the sun and its work of rekindling by fire, in whose progress another Mercury, and he gives you the picture of it so you know which of his four he's talking about, in whose progress another Mercury, the uterine brother of the first, becomes fully visible. Undoubtedly, in the same way that we want to pay close attention to how the completed lunar and solar magic of the elements speaks to us, we feel impelled to lend our eyes and ear to this hieroglyphic messenger. And by the will of God, he is that most celebrated Mercury of the philosophers, the microcosm. Okay, if you have studied Hermetic Kabbalah, make that microcosm into microprosopus, and you'll understand what to do with the atom that comes next. The most celebrated Mercury of the philosophers, the microcosm and atom. Indeed, some of the greatest experts used to put the sun itself in his place and rank. Thus, we cannot achieve in our present age unless we put in charge of this coral gold work a certain breath of life, which has been separated from his body by means of the pyronomic art. Sounds a little like a golem, doesn't it? And it can be. This act, however, is difficult to carry out and is also extremely perilous because of the fire and sulfuric vapor arising from it. But one thing is certain, this breath of life will be able to achieve marvelous things. Undoubtedly, it will tie with indissoluble bands Lucifer and even the fire being to the disk of the moon, or at least of Mercury, and in the third phase, as they want it, in order to complete our septenary number, showing us the sun of the philosophers. You see how exactly and openly the anatomy of our hieroglyphic monad here corresponds to the sacred mysteries signified in these theorems. Okay, if you don't see how exactly and openly it corresponds, let's go through it bit by bit, and I think you will. First, let's go through the actual graphic and see what he means by the entire realm of inferior astronomy, because it's not what you think. Usually inferior astronomy, just so you know, refers to, well, it can be inferior or interior, and it means the same thing. Now we think of it as planets closer to the sun. But the term originated with Ptolemaic or geocentric astronomy, which is still used by astrologers because we're doing astrology of people on Earth, right? So it's referring to Mercury and Venus, whether you are doing geocentric or heliocentric astronomy, Ptolemaic or Copernican. Now, in this way of looking at it, a planet is superior if it doesn't share what is called an epicycle. I'll define epicycle in the next slide, but you don't really need it. So what we think of it now is any planet further out from the sun than Earth. Now, if you look at this, though, we're talking about inferior astronomy, and we have Saturn here, we've got Jupiter, we've got Mars, all those are further away from the sun. And even in terms of Ptolemaic astronomy and astrology both, they don't have epicycles. So we might think, if we know what inferior astronomy means, what is he doing here? It makes no sense. Well, it will make sense when we talk about it in terms of physical alchemy, because inferior astronomy means something totally different if you're talking about physical alchemy. To use the example that most relatable to D, Ripley's compound of alchemy, Ripley uses a wheel of inferior astronomy that uses all of the planets that were known to him. And the idea is that there are planetary metals on Earth that are analogs of the ones associated with the planet. So interior or inferior, either one means on the Earth. It's like the microcosm, and the macrocosm is out where the planets actually are. So for more on this, there's a wonderful article by Jennifer Rampling who kind of broke this open for interested readers in an article called Depicting the Medieval Cosmos, George Ripley's Wheel of Inferior Alchemy, or you can wait till I get to that class after Theorem 14. But if we go through this graphic, I've answered this first question. Why are the superior planets here? It's because of physical alchemy, and we're going to talk about that later. Why is he using forms of Saturn and Jupiter that mirror each other? Well, I would think we're looking at some kind of rotation, right? It looks like we're looking at a rotation around this stylized Mercury in the middle, but maybe you'll come up with a different answer. I don't know. Why are they numbered? And what are the numbers? Just to make sure we're all working with the same numbers for the same planet. 1 is Saturn, 2 is Jupiter, 3 is the moon, 4 is going to be the first variant of Mercury, 5 is going to be Mars. He's just taken his Mars glyph and tilted it up. 6 is Venus. 7 is going to be the second variant of Mercury down here, or the sun. And the sun doesn't have the dot in it. Neither does this Mercury, neither do his symbols for Venus and Mars. And in the center is the entire Monas glyph, except it doesn't have a dot. If you wondered about epicycles and you want to try to make that match, good luck. Dee certainly had the books in his library about them. It was developed by Apollonius of Perga. Remember, Dee is an expert in ancient Greek writing. And then it was used by Hipparchus of Rhodes. That's another form of geocentric astronomy. And it was used by Ptolemy. It was later picked up by the Copernicans, and it's very, very mathematically accurate. So it's still used to this day to account for retrograde motion of the planet. But the idea is that you have these little cycles around big cycles, and you use it to figure out why a planet appears to be moving backwards in the sky, if that planet is Mercury and Venus, because it doesn't work for Mars or any planet outside of the orbit of the Earth. But you can, now that was just for your information. If you want to try to force in a reading of interior astronomy, the way that astrologers use the term today, but I'm telling you, it won't work very well. He's talking about it in terms of physical alchemy. And this theorem is about, first of all, projections onto the tree of life, so Kabbalah, and then later it will become about physical alchemy. So let's read through it. Is not the mystical character of Mars, there it is up top, forged from the hieroglyphs of the sun in Aries. There's the sun. Aries is down here with the magisterium of some of the elements, right? So we have a line, not both like in Venus. And Venus, I entreat you, isn't it formed from the sun? There's Venus, number 6. And a full unfolding of the elements. There's the whole cross of the elements. Thus, these planets gaze upon the circumvolutions of the sun. Now, magisterium, when he uses that term, we translated it that way, although it could just be translated as mastery. But it's, with the Latin Vulgate Bible, a specifically Catholic term concerned with the authority of the church alone. Only the church is supposed to interpret the word of God. And the way he's using it here is, well, frankly, blasphemous, but you'd have to understand a lot of things that people who are concerned with calling others blasphemers don't usually get this far into the monad. So if you just say magisterium as what you have here with Mars, you're looking at divine light. You're looking at the middle pillar. Is not the mystical character of Mars forged from the hieroglyphs of the sun and Aries with the middle pillar or divine light of some elements between them? Okay, so that's why we left that as magisterium. Now, when you get to this sentence, he writes a couple of words, actually the one after that, sorry, the third sentence, he writes some words in ancient Greek. So let's look at that a bit more closely. And Venus, I entreat you, isn't it formed from the sun in a full unfolding of the elements? Yes. And where do you find those elements on the tree of life? Some of you have worked with a cross of the elements in your Kabbalistic work. That would be exactly the same way he's using it here. But if you haven't done that, don't worry, you can still figure this out. Then he says, thus these planets gaze upon the circumvolutions of the sun. This sounds very geocentric. Well, let's not worry about whether it is or it isn't for a moment and look at it in terms of Kabbalah. Then the sun is Tifereth. And this circumvolution just is reminding us that you have a sphere, a perfect form in rotation. It's used by Plato. It's used a lot of other places in Greek writing. And then when you get to rekindling, you have a specifically alchemical term used by Democritus, or someone who claims to be Democritus, who we don't think anymore really was, with the yellowing phase of alchemy. So those will be of interest with physical alchemy, but rekindling by fire, what does that mean? Well, at the bottom of the monad, there's that Aries symbol, right? It seems that it is firing you up the tree. And it's work of rekindling by fire, in whose progress another Mercury, the uterine brother of the first, becomes finally visible. This is a conspicuous phrase in Latin, this uterine brother of the first. It echoes that in the Latin Vulgate Bible of the story of Joseph and his uterine brother. Now, of course, since that's in Genesis, it would be in Hebrew, but you know, Dee in his library didn't have any English Bibles. He had Latin Vulgate Bibles, and quite a few of them. When he wrote anything out in English from the Bible, it was usually his own translation, actually. Anyway, if you look at the story of Benjamin, what's the moral of the story of Benjamin? If you never studied it in Sunday school because you didn't go, well, great. Many of us never went. But what is supposed to be the moral of the story of Benjamin? Among other things, like be kind. But you can do more with that if you want to. Then uterine brother, that would kind of imply twins, right? So Mercury rules Gemini, the twins. Continuing on, Dee says, undoubtedly in the same way that we want to pay close attention to how the completed lunar and solar magic of the elements speaks to us. All right, treat this as Yesod Tifereth. The Tiferetic and Yesodic magic of the elements speaks to us. We feel impelled to lend our eyes and ear. Why singular? Is he talking only to people with one ear? No, it's a wordplay, and it's a beautiful wordplay. This particular declension of the noun, if you make it singular, it's aurum, and it plays upon this first person verb that means I overlay something with gold. Aurum, I overlay with gold some, whatever the direct object is going to be. And by the will of God, he is that most celebrated Mercury of the philosophers, the microcosm, and Adam. Again, think of all the word plays upon Adam, and think of Adam Cadman, Yeshua, and you can treat this as microprosopis. Indeed, some of the greatest experts used to put the sun itself in his place and rank. Just look up the difference between Adam, Zuaranpin, microprosopis. They're all clustered around Tifereth, the sun itself. The sun is referred to Tifereth. Or if you would prefer, substitute Christos. If you're a devout Christian, make this Jesus. And then you can start referring these to different Sephiroth. Indeed, some of the greatest experts used to put the sun itself in his place and rank. Notice, however, that while this is in caps, small caps, D doesn't come in here and capitalize what would be his in Latin. So that's allowing you to use it for multiple things, just like a ternary can be Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, but it can be other things. This we cannot achieve in our present age unless we put in charge of this coral gold work a certain breath of life which has been separated from his body by means of a pyronomic art. All right, that one sentence is the most complicated part of this theorem. So I did a wordplay video on gold coral work, and I got a link to it below. But for the purposes of what you're doing now, you can also just treat the coral gold work as the sun, as Tifereth, as gold, or as Christos. A certain breath of life. Think of breath as an animating force that While to the ancient Greeks, everything was alive. If you are a golem maker, you're trying to take red clay, right? Oh, Adam in Hebrew, and animate it with a soul. A certain breath of life which has been separated from his body by means of a pyronomic art. Well, see a related wordplay video on pyronomic also, because he's made up that word and the coral gold work. These are both made up Latin words that we have translated. But for the purposes of this assignment, you can just treat the means of the pyronomic art, his rekindling by fire. He's trying to move you up the tree of life. This act, however, is difficult to carry out and is also extremely perilous because of the fire and the sulfuric vapor arising from it. Well, those are physical alchemy references that you can ignore for now, except as a metaphor. Something is being fired. It would seem that it is the spirit is being fired and the dross is being burned out. If you have done path workings on the tree of life, one of the things that is supposed to come up is all the dross that needs to be burned out between this place and that place. Undoubtedly, it will tie with indissoluble bands. Lucifer. Why Lucifer? We could have just translated this as Venus, but we wanted to leave in the idea of Lucifer. For now, just read it as Venus, but think of Lucifer as a fallen angel. Why would he do that? Lucifer, the morning star. Venus is often the morning star. Okay, fire being. Just for now, consider that Mars. But what he is literally saying in Latin is not Mars, it's fire being. It will tie with indissoluble bands Lucifer and even the fire being to the disk of the moon, or at least of Mercury, and in the third place as they want it, in order to complete our septenary number, showing us the son of the philosophers. The son of the philosophers will be the philosopher's stone, won't it? Or would it be Tiferet? Or are they the same thing? You see how exactly and openly the anatomy of our hieroglyphic monad here corresponds to the sacred mysteries signified in these theorems. All right, so in Theorem 18, when we get there, John D is going to tell us that from the 12th and 13th theorems, the ones that had all these shapes we've been looking at, we can concentrate into a whole the concept that celestial astronomy serves as the parent and teacher to inferior astronomy. So rather than superior or an inferior, he's using terms from physical astronomy, celestial and inferior. Furthermore, he says, if we've understood what he said, we'll know that we have in these two theorems, 12 and 13, raised our Kabbalistic eyes that have been illuminated by the foregoing speculation upon these mysteries to the heavens. So your homework, map out for yourself the usual planetary and elemental attributions of the Sephiroth as you would do it from these theorems. Then go back and explain this theorem to yourself, assuming that it's a guide for how to heal the tree or restore the good or work up a smaller, more personal version of the great tree like people do in path workings. After Theorem 14, again, we'll look at it in terms of physical alchemy. But what we're doing now is, in my opinion, more important because D was not, as I've said many times before, he wasn't a successful physical alchemist. The person reportedly who succeeded was his friend Edward Kelly, and that's 2 decades later. But the projections that D is doing onto the tree of life in the hieroglyphic monad are still used by Hermetic Kabbalists. It's just that most Hermetic Kabbalists don't realize that this is the most obvious source. Okay, so that's your homework. I'm sorry that we are having a second version of this class, but I hope you have a wonderful day and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.